Welcome to Who Shaves the Barber, a weekly podcast where we explore paradoxes, thought experiments, and other pointless problems. I'm William Nava. All right, my guest today is Professor David Rosenthal, Professor of Philosophy at the CUNY Graduate Center, an expert in the philosophy of mind who's made numerous contributions to theories of consciousness, as well as theories of mental qualities, and theories of personal identity as well. Today we're going to be mostly focusing on consciousness and mental qualities. So first of all, welcome, Professor Rosenthal. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Okay, so let's dive right in. And I want to start out by talking about mental qualities. So can you first just let us know what exactly do we mean by mental qualities, and what are the kind of debates surrounding that?
So the qualitative character of our mental lives is probably clearest in connection with perceiving. So if I perceive a round red ball, then presumably I have an experience that I can describe in terms that echo the terms of the object that I'm seeing. So I can say, I'm seeing a round red ball, but I can also describe my experience as being of a round red ball or something like that. So the round and red stuff, the round and red aspect of my experience is what I'm calling qualitative character. And in that particular case, one of the mental qualities would be the redness, and one of the mental qualities would be the roundness. And I think that there is a big divide between two groups of theories about the qualitative aspect of our experiences. I should say, just in passing, obviously there will be qualitative aspects of some experiences that aren't perceptual. For example, emotional and bodily states such as pains and aches and tickles and itches and so forth. But I think it's convenient and easy to talk about mental qualities mainly in the perceptual case. So here is the big divide, I think, between two kinds of theories for dealing with mental qualities. One is what I call a consciousness-based kind of theory. And in a consciousness-based kind of theory, the way we know about our mental qualities is, metaphorically speaking, looking inward. That is to say, from our own experience, we know everything about mental qualities. And that's a very inviting kind of idea. How else would we know? And there's a certain way of thinking on which really the only person who knows about my qualitative experiences is me, and the only person who knows about your qualitative experiences is you, and that's the end of it. And that's a very rough sketch in common sense terms of what I'm calling a consciousness-based theory or picture of mental qualities, of the qualitative aspect of our mental lives. And on that, the basic thing is, on such a theory, the only way that we know about our qualitative experiences is from a first-person point of view, from consciousness. What consciousness allegedly tells us, I say tells us with these air quotes, because it's not clear that, that's a metaphor of some sort or another. It's not clear how to cash that metaphor out. But I'll come back to that. Okay. It seems to me that this is a bad way of thinking about mental qualities. And here's the basic way of seeing why it's a bad way. It might be that I see a round red ball, and you say, David, do you see that round red ball? And I say, yes. Or it might be that you think that I'm seeing a round red ball, but I'm actually looking somewhere else. So you and I can talk about my qualitative experiences.
Mm-hmm.
You and I can talk about the same conscious mental qualities that I can talk about, both of us. How is that possible? If the only way to tell about my mental qualities is from what consciousness tells me, where do you get off saying anything at all? And it's a little more than that. So to switch from perception to a bodily state, namely pain, supposing something happens to me and you say, you must be in pain. And I say, no, I'm not. So you and I are using the term pain in the same way. Because the only way that I can, you asked me, am I in pain? I said, no, I'm not. The only way that we can be communicating is if we're using the word in the same way. And you're using the word to talk about my state.
Mm-hmm.
You're not using the word to talk about your state. So there must be some way in which the third person ascription of words like pain and the first person ascription, they have to meet. They have to come together. A more dramatic way of seeing this is I could say, I'm not in pain, and you could say you must be. Or I could say I am in pain, and you could say you're not. And this is not just make-believe. I can be in a doctor's office, and the doctor can say, you're not in pain, you just think you are, for reasons. I can come back to why somebody would be mistaken about being in pain and downstream if you'd like me to. But that why I might be mistaken isn't so much the issue here. The issue is that you and I can communicate using the same terms about my mental qualities. So it must be that there are ways to find out about somebody's mental qualities other than what consciousness tells that person. The way in which you were telling about my perceptual experience of whether I was seeing a round red ball is you see that there's a round red ball in my environment, and you see that I'm staring at it, right? And you assume that, given that, I have an experience of a round red ball. That's my experience. So you're going on what I could call the perceptual role. The perceptual role of an experience is how it relates to my perceptual functioning. There's a red round ball in my environment. I'm looking at it. So you're assuming that I have that experience. And the same kind of thing goes with the pain. If a brick falls in my foot, you figure I'm in pain. Maybe I'm not in pain, anesthetic, who knows what the story is. But you see me interacting with the environment in a certain way, or the environment interacting with me, and you extrapolate from that to a perceptual role, and from the perceptual role, you go for my mental qualities, my qualitative states. So on that view, no, it's not the case that what consciousness tells me is the only thing that we know about mental qualities. We also know about mental qualities. So the mental quality of redness, that's a quality that arises typically when I see something that's red, or when you see something that's red. Pain, that arises typically when there's some damage to the tissues, and so forth. So we have a pretty good idea of how we can tell about mental qualities independent of what consciousness tells us. And so that class of theories I call perceptual role theories. And it seems to me that consciousness-based theories can't accommodate the fact that first and third person access, both of them occur with mental qualities. The only way we can do this is by way of a perceptual role theory.
So I guess the first question that comes to mind hearing that is, I think an intuitive kind of response might be that the kinds of ways that we have of finding out about somebody else's mental qualities in the ways that you just described all involve certain inferences, whereas the internal consciousness-based has a certain kind of immediacy to it. And so that somebody might want to say, well, the access that we get via consciousness is a kind of direct access to the mental qualities themselves. We're sort of given them immediately, whereas the perceptual category gives us inferences that allow us to kind of deduce or infer that certain mental qualities are likely going on, but don't give us the mental qualities themselves, so to speak.
So I think that that's a very inviting way of looking at things, but I think it needs to be spelled out a little bit, and needs to be spelled out in two ways. One is there will be situations. So I'm walking down the street and a truck runs into me. I'm still conscious. I'm lying there screaming and moaning with various broken limbs. And you're there and you say to yourself, David is in pain. I don't think that you're aware of any inference. You just see the truck runs into me. You see that I'm moaning and groaning and so forth, right? Broken limbs. You just see in a way that seems completely unmediated, completely non-inferential. You see that I'm in pain. So you might say, well, good. It seems to be non-inferential. It seems as though there's no inference involved, but there really is. And that's fair enough. There probably really is an inference involved. It goes very quickly. You don't notice it. It's unconscious inference. The thing that I want to stress is that's all fine, but it seems unmediated. And now turn to the way I'm aware of my own pain. The way I'm aware of my own pain also seems unmediated. The fact that it seems unmediated doesn't mean that it is. Mm-hmm. And when one reflects on what does it mean for me, David, to be aware of my pain in a way that seems unmediated, well, one part of the brain is talking to another part of the brain, presumably. And so there's some process here. Maybe it's a kind of an inferential process. Maybe it's some other kind of process. But anyway, the picture then of immediacy drops out a little bit. It's not so much immediate. It's not the kind of thing that contrasts with third-person access in the way that you were suggesting. It seems unmediated, and third-person access very often seems unmediated. When I see you looking at a red round ball, and I say to myself, well, he sees the red round ball, it doesn't seem to me as though I'm making an inference in the way that I might make an inference when I'm filling out my taxes or something.
Mm-hmm. I think this is a very a similar kind of question. Maybe you'll think it's the same question in different words. You tell me. So forget the issue of immediacy. I might want to put it this way. It's not about immediacy or inference. It's that when it's first person, what I have access to, whether it's mediated or not, is the mental quality itself. Whereas if it's third person, if it's me thinking about your mental qualities, then even if it feels rather immediate, what I'm getting is a fact about your mental qualities or some idea about your mental qualities. I haven't gotten the mental quality itself, so to speak.
Well, I'm not quite sure that I agree with that way of describing things, but let me take a shot at putting what you said in a different way and see whether you think that I'm actually putting what you said in a different way or just saying something different. Look, if it's my pain or my experience of red, right, then it's mine. And what I get in a first-person way is my experience. What you get about me is my experience, right? So there is a contrast, But the contrast, I don't think, is one between the mental quality itself and a fact about the mental quality. The contrast is whether it's a fact about your mental quality or my mental quality. Well, if it's mine, and you have access to it in this third-person way, then it's not your mental quality, it's mine. So obviously, you're not going to be aware of it in the way that I am. I certainly agree about that. I'm aware of it as mine. You're aware of it as mine.
Right.
And that's a big contrast. I mean, if it's pain, it makes all the difference in the world. But also, if it's a perceptual state, it makes all the difference in the world. So, yeah, go on.
I think that is more or less what I was asking. And it sounds like you're, in a way, saying there are different ways of experiencing or having ideas about or in any way addressing mental qualities. One of those happens to be subjective, and that's a very particular way. But it is not. But it is not the only way.
Well, the word subjective sometimes has been used to carry a lot of weight, and so I'm a little. I mean, it seems to me that if I were to agree to use that word, I would want to know what you mean by subjective. But if it's my mental quality, if it's my pain, say, then for me, knowing about my pain is knowing about my pain. For you, knowing about my pain is knowing about somebody else's pain. And my pain will hurt me, right? It won't hurt you except maybe empathetically. And so that's going to be a significant difference, but it's not a difference in the nature of the access as much as a difference in whose state it is.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think what I'm trying to state that I think is a kind of popular idea is that the first person access, so to speak, to a mental quality has a very special kind of, it's a very special kind of thing. And that it's a sort of different sort of thing from other kinds of things. And so if you have that first person access to a mental quality, the idea is that, that because that kind of experience is so kind of unique, that a third person access to it is not really access to the mental quality itself.
I just don't agree that it's not. It's not access to the mental quality in the same way, but I think it is access to the mental quality. So if you see me hit by the truck and lying on the ground screaming and moaning and whatever, right? And you, without any conscious inference, it's just sort of you see that I'm in pain, right? That's the way we would speak about it, I think. Mm-hmm. We would know directly, without having to figure it out, right? And I think that the big difference is it's not your pain, right? Mm-hmm. I'm the one who has the pain. So, of course, it's very special when I'm aware of my pain in a way that it isn't. I mean, I hope that you would feel very bad for me being hit by a truck and so forth. On the other hand, you weren't hit by a truck. So it is a special thing when I'm aware of my own states, right? But that's because they're my states. Right, whatever they are, maybe instead of pain, it's some kind of pleasurable experience. Maybe it's just some neutral experience as regards pleasure and pain, like seeing a red round ball or something like that. It doesn't matter in any of these cases. It's special to me if it's my experience because it's my experience. But it seems to me you just see automatically that I'm in pain. It's my pain, that very qualitative state that you're aware of.
Mm-hmm.
aren't you?
Yeah,
I mean, if you're not, I think something, frankly, is wrong with you because, I've just been hit by a truck, I'm moaning on the ground, and you just see that I'm in pain.
yeah. So
That's an automatic human response.
yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I actually think this is probably as good a place as any to ask you um, about the so-called hard problem, because I think we're very much in that territory at this point. I mean, so the hard problem of consciousness, as I understand it, is this idea that there's this great difficulty in accounting for the existence of mental qualities, essentially. And I know that you don't think there really is a hard problem. So can you? Because I think this is very much already in the realm of what we've been talking about. Can you give your account for why you don't think there really is a hard problem?
Well, uh, let me say a couple of things here. So, David Chalmers originally formulated this idea that there's a hard problem, and the way he did this was to contrast what he called the hard problem with the easy problem. The easy problem, he thought, was figuring out in the brain what's going on when you have a particular qualitative state. The hard problem is the jump from the brain to the qualitative state. So we've already talked about this kind of approach to mental qualities that I'm calling perceptual-role approach. On a perceptual-role approach, roughly speaking, we fix the kind of mental quality that something is, say, a mental quality of red, by the role that it plays in perceiving. Now, so we've got a red stimulus out there in the world. The red stimulus is lighted properly with some source of illumination. The light rays bounce off the red thing and enter my eyes, and then they go back through the optic nerve and the LGN and so forth, and they end up in visual cortex, and they go to V4, which is where color gets tuned up and so forth and so on. And we know all this. We know all this. So if we're fixing what kind of mental quality a mental quality is by way of the role that it plays in perception, what's the mystery? What's the hard problem? This is the easy problem, right? We wouldn't even need to know all of this sort of neuro stuff that I waved my hands at very quickly. We'd simply need to know that somehow the red of the object gets into the eyes and it goes back and it does something or another in the brain. Whatever it is, it plays a role in perception. And the role in perception fixes the mental quality, right? So we've got a connection between whatever the brain is doing in order to carry out this perceptual role, and the mental quality is fixed by that very same perceptual role. So there's no running broad jump that we need to do from the brain to the mental quality. It's a very smooth transition, right? Now, the way that you get it to be not a smooth transition is if you have a consciousness-based view in which the only way that we know about our mental qualities is what consciousness tells us. Well, whatever that means, it doesn't sound like a connection with the brain. It sounds like, from a first-person point of view, I just know this, and the brain doesn't matter at all for that. And then there is a big jump between mental qualities and the brain. And so it's a way of setting things up that generates the appearance of a hard problem. But I was urging before, because of the need to make the first person and third person access play nicely with each other, come together, because of that need, the way of setting it up is defective. That a consciousness-based view about mental qualities doesn't really work.
Mm-hmm. So I think so. I understand how.
So it's a little bit of a story, but roughly, I mean, to just summarize it, so a consciousness-based view would make it seem as though it's problematic how to get to the brain, how to get between the brain and mental qualities, right? But if a consciousness-based view isn't correct, then perceptual role, that's made for going back and forth between the brain and mental qualities. It's just a very easy transition.
Right. So I think that makes sense, and the way you describe the perceptual role approach is clear. I think. Maybe I'm misunderstanding it, but I think if I ask
look
this,
like
it'll
you
be
have
clear.
doubts.
Well, here's my question. As I understand the hard problem, the concern is with the mental quality as a first-person experience, and the concern, I think, is with the suspicion that that things of a first-person nature have a special kind of ontology. And what I mean by that is that the sort of experiential sense of the quality seems to be a different sort of thing, as opposed to just I don't know, material stuff. And I think putting it that way is probably not best, because it seems to presuppose, like, I'm pretty much question-begging dualism if I phrase it that way. But I think you understand more or less what I mean, because it's something that people who talk about the hard problem seem to always posit. So it seems to me like the concern that I have is that by taking a perceptual role approach, you seem to already presuppose that the kind of first-person experience aspect of this is not what needs to be explained. So in a way, you said, look, if we take a consciousness approach, a consciousness-based approach, you're setting things up to get stuck in this hard problem, because you're focusing on this conscious awareness of the mental quality.
Right.
But then if you take the perceptual role approach, aren't you in a way, by taking the perceptual role approach, kind of just from the beginning saying, I'm not really going to worry about the first person experience version of this, so there's nothing to explain? It seems like almost both ways are either presupposing a problem or ignoring a problem.
Well, so you started with what you said, in effect saying something about ontology, and you said I would understand that because that's what people who like the hard problem posit. I think let's step back a little bit here. It seems to me that if somebody wants to reject a perceptual role approach, they have to do one of two things. They have to either accept that you really, in a radical way, don't know anything about my mental qualities. And this seems to be something along the order of insane. I mean, clinically. That is to say, it really isn't the case that if any of us went around in life thinking that we didn't understand about other people's mental qualities, we'd be locked up. We wouldn't be able to function. Even minimally. And so that's one possibility. It seems to be an insane possibility. The other possibility is that such a person has to explain how we do know about other people's mental qualities. And I haven't seen any of the consciousness-based crowd explain anything like that. They don't. So it seems somewhat as though they want to have their cake and eat it too. They want to be able to say, look, really, in a serious way, whatever that means, in a serious way, we don't know about anybody else's, but we pretend to, right? And I don't think that that's a reasonable attitude to have here. Either we do or we don't, right? It seems to me there's nothing about our pretending to, right? I mean, so supposing I start pretending that I know about your mental qualities, and supposing I get it right 93% of the time or 87% of the time, which I will, because we're pretty good at this, right? I'm not pretending. That's not pretense. Then I know, right? And the question is, how do I know? And the question is particularly pivotal for a consciousness-based theorist, because the question then is, how could I possibly know given that person's theory, given that person's approach to what mental qualities are? So it seems to me that you're right in a way. If one is a perceptual-role person, there isn't going to be a hard problem, and if one is a consciousness-based person, it will seem as though there is. But it seems to me that the consciousness-based person has some serious work to do before we even open the door there, right? There's another side of it, I think, and that is that we really do. See, I don't think it's so much. Here's a thing that's been shown experimentally at great length by experimental psychologists. It's perfectly true in some circumstances that I'll be able to take guesses about what I'm perceiving, even when I'm not conscious of perceiving it, even when the perceiving is subliminal. And that those guesses will be something in the between 80 and 90% accurate. I'm not making that number up. That's actually what the experimental literature shows, that in cases where I'm correct at all, right, in the kinds of case where I can get it right, at least sometimes, about what I'm perceiving, even when my perceiving isn't conscious, even when I'm not subjectively aware of perceiving, I'll get it right 80 to 90% of the time. And there are various different kinds of ways in which I can be unaware of perceiving. So it's not so much, I think, first-person access. That must be a kind of first-person access. It's a funny kind of first-person access, though it's a first-person access, and it's a first-person access. Most people would say, well, I can't do that, right? So you put an experimental subject in a situation, you give the person a subliminal experience, and you say, guess. And the person says, I can't guess. I mean, I didn't see it. And you say, please just humor me, guess. And they get it right something like over 80% of the time. And then you tell them, right? And they say, oh, wow, that's interesting. But, there's nobody doing the guessing except that experimental subject. So it is a kind of first-person access, right? But it's a funny kind of first-person access because it's not conscious. It's guessing. Now, given that can be the case, I don't think that the hard problem is exactly about the first person. I think the hard problem, what those guys have in mind, the people who think that there is a hard problem, which I don't, the people who think that there is a hard problem think that it has to do with consciousness. And I do think that it's very important to explain what's going on when a qualitative experience is conscious. And because sometimes it isn't. Sometimes there will be this subliminal kind of perceiving, right, which isn't conscious. And as you know, I have a whole different theory about that. It's not the same as my theory about mental qualities. Should I go into that at this point?
I want to ask you a couple other things and then get into that.
Sure.
So just hold on that for 1 second.
Absolutely.
First, I'm actually just curious because I think that you mentioned subliminal perception in a number of your papers about this, and it seems like to me, it seems like a really strong evidence in support of your view. The fact that subliminal perception happens, and the fact that it's experimentally been verified, and in the stat you just gave, that people still are able to kind of gather information from subliminal perception even though they don't even notice it, I think is very strong evidence in support of your view. And I'm actually just curious what sorts of things you've heard from the consciousness-based folks to explain that when they tie consciousness to mental qualities, as if sort of consciousness was really fundamental or necessary to having mental qualities. How do they respond to the objection from subliminal perception?
That's a very good question. The general line in this is, look, there is a kind of unconscious perceiving. Some of them deny unconscious perceiving, but a good many of them are perfectly comfortable with unconscious perceiving. But the thing is that they don't think that what's going on in such cases as subliminal perceiving and then the guessing that gets it right and so forth and so on, they don't think that that's a case of anything psychological or mental. Well, maybe I should keep the word psychological and mental apart here. They think that there's something going on that a psychologist could study. So there's something going on in that sense psychologically, but there's nothing that's distinctively mental. And the way that has been, the term that's been used for this in the last 40 years or so of work on these things, it's often described as subpersonal processes instead of personal level processes. I don't know quite what that means, and I'm not the only one who doesn't know what it means. It's a rather debatable term, but what it's meant to do, what the term is intended to do is say, look, it's really true that consciousness is intrinsic to qualitative states. So these states that occur subliminally aren't qualitative, right? There's something down below, there's processing that the brain goes through of some sort or another, but it doesn't count as qualitative. This doesn't seem to me, it's a move that isn't, I think, completely 100% refutable, but I think it's one of these moves that theorists sometimes make that looks like it's opportunistic, that is not really based on anything. And the way to see that is, what'll happen is you subliminally present me with a round red stimulus. I don't consciously see it, but I can guess with great accuracy about it. And also, there's another psychological phenomenon that occurs in these kinds of cases called priming. So if you present me with a red stimulus, it'll prime me downstream to be quicker to pick up on red stimuli than, say, on green stimuli. So that's a priming effect. And it'll prime me to be quicker on saying red than on saying some other color, right? So it has a downstream psychological effect, and the downstream psychological effect is keyed to redness. It's not keyed to something else. It might be keyed to roundness. It might be keyed to all sorts of things, and this can actually happen conceptually too. If you show, this is a funny thing, if you show somebody a picture of a bank subliminally, then the person will be primed for things having to do with money. If you show somebody a picture of a riverbank, people will be primed for things having to do with money because of the ambiguity of that word in English, right? So it's getting into whatever processing our language, the language part of the brain is doing, and it's crossing over from one meaning of bank to the other meaning of bank, and it's having a priming effect. It's really marvelous. So there are all sorts of very rich psychological effects that subliminal perceptions can have. And it seems to me that just from a theoretical point of view, it's hard to see why you wouldn't want to describe those in qualitative terms.
That makes sense. I want to ask you one more series of questions probably before moving into the higher order thought stuff.
Right.
And that is that we actually haven't gone over your quality space theory. Do you think you can give a kind of, especially since we've done a lot of the kind of background work at this point, can you give a quick summary of what the quality space theory actually is?
Sure. So quality space theory is a version of a perceptual role theory of mental qualities. And the way quality space theory works is this. You can present subjects with two stimuli that are kind of close, 2 shades of red, say. And then you can manipulate, say you're doing this with some machine that adjusts the wavelengths, right? So you can manipulate things so that the 2 shades of red get closer and closer and closer and closer until they're indistinguishable. So the last step, before they became indistinguishable, will be the smallest difference in that range that a particular subject can perceive. Because the distribution of color-sensitive cells in the retina is different from one person to another, this will be slightly different for you and me, but you can sort of do one person and get a pretty good picture of that person, and then you can extrapolate. You can sort of assume that you can average over people in general. So what we just did was we found the 2 closest shades for a particular area of redness that the person can distinguish, right? You can also start with identical wavelengths for the 2 samples and then make them less and less, make them more and more different, right? And even when they're different, because we're not perfect perceivers, we don't perceive every difference in wavelength, you'll get to a certain point where the wavelengths are different enough that the person will say, oh, they're different now, right? And technically in psychology, that's called a just noticeable difference. And so this concept of a just noticeable difference can be applied for any perceptual modality. For smelling or tasting or hearing, audition, and so forth. Now, imagine that what we do is we have a particular individual, we test for this just noticeable difference, and then we test for the one just next to it, and the one just next to it, and the one just next to it, until you get to the edge of where the person can't perceive anymore. And you create a map of the stimuli that the person can discriminate. And now, thinking in perceptual role terms, we hypothesize that mental qualities are the states, are the mental properties that permit an individual to make these perceptual discriminations. So, for every difference that there is in this map of stimuli that the subject can discriminate, there will be in that subject the ability to be in states with 2 different mental qualities. So the map of the discriminable stimuli will also serve as a map of all the mental qualities that that individual is capable of being in. So now we have what I call a quality space. It's a space. It may be a variable number of dimensions. I wrote a joint paper with a couple of people who specialize in olfaction, and one of them hypothesizes that we'll need at least 11 dimensions in order to capture all of the discriminations that human subjects can make among olfactory stimuli. So it doesn't have to be, it won't be a flat map, right? In the case of color, there's hue, red versus green and so forth, but there's also brightness and saturation. So we'll need at least 3 dimensions for just the colors, right? And for every perceptual modality, you should be able to do this. You can just test an individual for just noticeable differences, build a map of the just noticeable differences among the stimuli, and that will, in effect, be a map of the mental qualities in virtue of which those discriminations are possible. So this is a very precise way of thinking about the nature of mental qualities in perceptual role terms.
Yeah, that's. I think it's a really fascinating theory, and it makes a lot of sense. I want you to speak about it in relation to. So one of your papers introduces it by talking about the undetectable inversion hypothesis, and I think it's a very interesting thought experiment to think of in relation to quality space theory. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I think that this business about undetectable inversion is a very useful, almost pivotal way of thinking about these things because, among other things, it's a way of illustrating the difference between a perceptual role approach, such as quality space theory, and a consciousness-based. So let's start with consciousness-based. So according to consciousness-based, the only way that I have of telling about my mental qualities is from the inside, from a first-person consciousness point of view, right? So if that's true, then what is consciousness telling me? Just consciousness telling me that there are all these qualities, right? And I could imagine that the qualities could be shifted in some way. So I could put red in where green is and green in where red is, and that would be fine. There's nothing that consciousness is telling me that seems to preclude that. On the other hand, if mental qualities are a matter of states that are playing a particular perceptual role, then there is something that's going to block this. And this emerges very, very clearly, I think, in connection with the quality space theoretic version of a perceptual role approach. So imagine that you have just, let's abstract away from the 3 dimensions and just consider for color, let's just consider hue. So red, green, purple, orange, and all of those. So we've got a 2-dimensional map that is going to take care of those. Now, imagine that there is an axis down the middle of that space, and you could flip the quality space. That is to say, the 2 sides of the axis are completely symmetrical. So if you folded it over on that axis, point by point, the 2 sides would match. Now unfold it, so you've got the 2 sides there. And let's say you've got a mental quality that's defined in terms of relative location on the left side, and a mental quality that's defined in terms of relative location on the right side. The relative locations will be indistinguishable. That is to say, from a subjective point of view, if the quality space is symmetrical in this way, so that there's an axis of symmetry down the middle, right, so that you could fold it over and they would be identical, then relative location is the same for the 2 corresponding points on the 2 sides.
So if I may replace it just to make sure I'm understanding it, if it were really possible for 2 different mental qualities to be switched and yet have all of their kind of relationships to other mental qualities still be in the same shape so that you could really do that switch, then according to quality space theory, according to this symmetrical map, they would actually have to be indistinguishable, and we wouldn't be able to actually discriminate based on these mental qualities.
That's part of it, but it's in a way worse than that, because so consider the left-hand side and the right-hand side of the symmetrical space. It's not just the two that could be switched, right? If the relative locations are indistinguishable in these ways, then they could all be switched. And you would really have undetectable inversion around this axis. But the cost of the undetectable inversion is very steep, because the qualities on the two sides would be indistinguishable from the point of view of the perceptual roles that they're playing. They would play the same perceptual role. Now, an interesting fact, which people who like undetectable inversion don't like, is we know of absolutely no quality space for any creature that's been studied so far that's symmetrical in this way. We know of no quality space where there is such an axis of symmetry. In every quality space that we know of, there's an asymmetry, however you look at it, right? So that seems to be something that fits with quality space theory. That is to say, what would happen in quality space theory is if there were an axis of symmetry, you'd fold it over because the two sides would be indistinguishable, and that would just cut the space in half, right? And the reason that this doesn't happen in actual testing is because there is no axis of symmetry, right? It's just impossible to find one. So the people who talk about undetectable inversion have come some years ago. They've come around to conceding that undetectable inversion is actually not possible, right? It won't ever occur. But they say, I could imagine a creature where there is a symmetrical quality space, right? None of our creatures have symmetrical quality space, but I can imagine one. Mm-hmm. And I think that there's an argument against that, which is, roughly speaking, well, you think you can imagine that because if you're just looking inside, if you just have a consciousness-based idea of these things, there are no constraints. It looks as though you could imagine anything. But if you realize that you've got to deal with perceptual role, then when you figure out what the true nature of the mental qualities are, namely they're tied to perceptual roles, you won't be able to get that, right? And so when you think you're imagining undetectable inversion, you're not really imagining anything about mental qualities. You're imagining something about make-believe mental qualities. So I think that that's a solid argument that undetectable inversion not only isn't possible for actual creatures, but it isn't even conceivable. That when we think we're conceiving of it, we're conceiving of something for make-believe mental qualities that don't satisfy the actual conditions that mental qualities have to satisfy.
And those conditions being that they play a role in discrimination.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. That's really fascinating. I'd always found that the inversion thought experiment interesting. I didn't have any strong opinions on it, but yeah, your argument against it is really fascinating and really powerful.
Let me say another thing about the way you just put it, that the nature of mental qualities has to do with perceptual discriminations. So supposing from a first-person point of view, I say, well, I can tell the difference between this shade of red and this shade of red, right? I can't tell the difference so I can tell the difference between shade 1 and shade 2. I can't tell the difference between shade 3 and shade 4. Well, you're automatically going to think that when I have an experience of shade 3 and shade 4, it's the same mental quality. That's just, you'll think that given what I just described for myself, that's what's going on. And I think that that is evidence that really we do think that there is an important connection between perceptual role and mental quality. And if we try to figure out what the mental qualities are, and this is even for the first person case. So if I say to myself, well, I wonder about my own mental qualities. Well, if I can discriminate, then I've got two. If I can't discriminate, I don't have two. I have two samples of the same one, right? So it's not as though you can figure out the connection between perceptual role and mental quality, even from a first-person point of view.
Yeah, that makes sense. And that concludes today's episode of Who Shapes the Barber? Next week, Professor Rosenthal explains his higher-order thought theory of consciousness, and why he thinks consciousness serves little to no function at all. Again, I'm William Nava. You can check out other episodes, as well as my other philosophical and artistic work, at williamnava.com. And if you'd like to subscribe to this podcast, go to williamnava.podbean.com. Thank you so much for listening.